As telco complaints drop, why are Australian mobile users still unhappy?
And what does the Optus hack mean for Australians?
And what does the Ethereum merge mean for the future of crypto?
And why is Intel putting Pentium out to pasture? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to dive into the big stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined as usual by Alex Kidman, the newly crowned king of podcasting. Your Majesty, what will be your first decree?
Well, obviously, I'm going to need more bowing and scraping from you, Turner. That was not surf-like enough. But specifically, I'm going to bring back the guillotine. Big popular thing. People can come watch it. And specifically, I'm going to bring it back for those websites that automatically check extra options that you may or may not want. So, you go to book that flight and they say, oh, you want some travel insurance and extra baggage and an extra in-flight meal. Just those sneaky little add-up charges things. Find the people responsible for them. Heads off. Because let's face it, if we're going to have a monarch, if we have to have a monarch, and it's going to be me, then I want to be one of those inspires through terror monarchs from day one.
I can hear Aaron shouting in the distance, yes! So speaking of inspiring terror, we're also joined by Alex's brother, the evil Prince Angus Kidman from Finder. Hey, Gus, what will your first decree be when you seize the throne?
Well, I think I'll just go with the obvious, and I'll just appoint Felicity Kendall as my queen. So, because, as we all know, she's sweetly pretty and just what a real girlie should be.
That's an incredibly dated reference. I'm also slightly disturbed by the idea that Gus is going to succeed me as king, because this is setting up some kind of Game of Thrones with Kidman.
I was going to say, he gets to be Doctor Who, and you're the guy from Hot Fuzz.
Oh, man.
Now, speaking of such, it's a week where too much tech news is barely enough. We're looking at TIO complaints, the great Ethereum merge, the great Optus hack. But first, it's time to say goodbye to an old friend. Well, actually, two old friends, but I can't see anyone pouring one out for Celeron. Gus, what's the story here?
So, amusingly, we've learned this week that Intel is finally going to drop the Pentium brand name. We've all been in this industry long enough to remember just about when Pentium was actually introduced. It was actually in 1993 that the Pentium first appeared, and at the time it was the mega powerful thing. But now it has been hanging around on the cheapest Intel processors for the cheapest Windows clones you could kind of be running stuff on. But Intel's decided that that's too confusing, so it's dropping the Pentium branding. And from now on, if you buy a cheap PC, it's just going to have a Intel processor with inspired branding there.
Yeah, it's a weird one, because you're right. Anything that's got Pentium on it that you're buying new right now is a very cheap, very slow machine. And there's been this weird interoperability between Pentium and Celeron badges, except that these are typically, in Australian terms, your sub $500 machines. Your really cheap little simple student laptops, for example. You'll see them a lot in. But it at least made it a little bit clearer if you were trying to work out, well, what's the difference between that $400 laptop and that $400 laptop? It's not at all clear to me at this point, and I don't think Intel's said quite enough as to how I'm going to pick between Intel processors, or indeed how your regular consumer is going to pick through them, because I'm a fussy bugger, you know.
Yeah. My gut feel is that the regular consumer in that, they're just looking at price. Like when you're buying that machine, you're not looking at any other spec other than, can I get away with the $400 machine rather than the $600 machine? Like, we've long moved past that thing where an average household might care about what processor was running in there. I'm leaving aside our specialized, games-loving brethren who are going to build their own machine. But for the average person who's purchasing a laptop, I just don't think the issue arises. And I think price point is everything.
But do friends let friends buy Pentium computers these days? Surely you want a Core i3 unless it was for a primary school kid.
It depends on your needs, as always. I mean, this is the real fundamental thing of it. And there's a bit more, I think, now into what makes those machines good or bad, especially things like RAM. And admittedly, a lot of those machines you still see coming out with just a 2 gig or 4 gig of RAM, and on Windows 10 and 11,
oh no,
they do not run well. But that's more to do with memory allocation than processor per se for the kind of tasks they're going to be doing, because they're largely, they're on websites, they're doing a little bit of basic document processing, not much more than that. And if that's all you need out of a computer, that's fine. That's great. Don't overspend.
Exactly, but I think at that point, and this is possibly where some differentiation might have been useful, if I was recommending, if someone just wants that really basic machine and they're looking at that $400 space, I think you get more grunt and more reliability out of buying a Chromebook at that price than you do buying a dirt cheap Windows machine. So if you're at that price point and you're mostly doing things in the browser, I suspect you're going to have a better experience in the Chromebook universe than you are in the dirt cheap sub notebook kind of area.
Or even arguably in the tablet space.
Which is what I thought Gus was going to say, actually, but yeah.
Yeah, you're getting awfully close to that base iPad price. It's a much more controlled environment, obviously, and you've got a spring extra for the keyboard. But you could build a reasonable sort of machine out of something like that. And obviously there are cheaper Android tablets out there as well, although the quality and the speed really does start to vary a lot there.
Yeah, so you've got these options there, and I guess Intel's keeping its hand in it, saying, "Hey, let's get rid of this iconic brand." I mean, the thing about Pentium that we forget now because it was so long ago is that actually, as a brand name, that's one of the first times, really, in consumer tech when the brand name started mattering rather than having some kind of what seemed like a logical label, because the Pentium was the successor to the 486, which was the successor to the 386, 286, x86. And it was like, okay, there's a sort of hidden 5 reference, but hey, we're going to go with this interesting sounding brand. And then when they did the successor, I just started as a journalist when the speculation was, what's the Pentium successor going to be called? And we all thought it was going to be called the Sexium, because that just seemed like the logical way to go. Missed opportunity. But they stuck with, no, they said Pentium's our brand, so they in fact went with Pentium 2 and Pentium Pro and variants thereof. But it's the same era when Windows went from having dull version numbers to being Windows 95. Like, there's a real sea change that was happening back when we were all, young, strapping tech journalists just getting our way on in the world, where suddenly branding kind of mattered. And it's interesting that we've come so far now that Intel thinks its brand is the one it needs to put in front of it rather than having this sub-brand that was the thing you might recognize.
Gentlemen, we're all ignoring the really critical problem that this new branding creates.
Which is
that Weird Al is going to have to sing "It's All About the Intel Processors, Baby," and it's just not going to sound the same.
Does Weird Al do that song in concert anymore? I feel like he doesn't hang on to his parodies that long.
I have seen him do that song in concert. I mean, we're getting massively off track, but yes, I have seen him do that song. What, in this decade? This is my question. You've seen Weird Al do a few concerts. I haven't seen Weird Al this decade, so that is a fair point.
I think we're the last people who should be saying "in this decade" based on the last 5 minutes of conversation. So speaking of grunt under the bonnet, this week we've been talking about the big Ethereum merge. Alex, what's it all about and why should we care?
So, as the regular listeners will know, I'm not super keen on crypto myself, but this is a reasonably positive step. It's a very large-scale change in the way that Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency by market valuation, I believe, at the time of recording anyway, because these things are so fluid, has massively changed how it mathematically operates in a way that radically changes the amount of power and computational power, but also electrical power, the environmental impact of the cryptocurrency's existence, such that it goes from, I think the figures I was seeing, it goes from an annual power usage equivalent to the Netherlands down by something extraordinary like 99.9%.
Yeah, it's a massive drop because they're shifting from the classic model that's used in most of the best-known cryptos is what's known as proof of work, where you do something computationally awkward in the background, and once you've done enough of those things, you generate an extra coin, essentially. Bitcoin works like that. Ethereum has worked like that. It's now moving to this more complex model called proof of stake, and if I tried to explain that, your listeners would all pass out from boredom. But essentially, it amounts to saying, well, people who've got a small holding in that crypto essentially say, well, we'll put some of this aside that can be used to validate that this crypto is real, and then we'll use that to check part of the blockchain. Like, it is more complex than that, but that's the essence of it. But yes, the big deal about this is that it means that for Ethereum, it's one of the big two cryptos, it really is, it's massively downgrading its environmental impact. That's a good thing. It may not be as good a thing as Ethereum fanboys will tell you, because there's a lot of machines that were out there that were busy doing Ethereum mining, essentially trying to do this stuff. what's going to happen to them now? They're not going to get put aside. Whoever was running those is going to go, what's some other coin I can start generating stuff on? So those machines are probably going to keep operating. So I think I bear that in mind before I threw too many, wow, Ethereum's great kind of parties. But it is a big transition, and it does mean that now we've got one big proof of work coin and one big proof of stake coin, and it's kind of like this theoretical battle for the soul of cryptocurrency. Well, actually, it's not, because, of course, cryptocurrency doesn't have a soul, but if it did, where we'd be going.
But so Ethereum's like setting an example for some either crypto that will be invented in the future or some of the cryptocurrencies that already exist of, look, this can be done. We are one of the biggest after Bitcoin. We're the biggest and we did it. So it's sort of in that way, it's perhaps ensuring that the future of crypto is less power consuming, not just Ethereum itself.
You'd hope so, but there are some, these things are all decided on community consensus, and some people don't agree. There's already a fork happening for Ethereum for people who thought this was a terrible idea, so they want to stick with a proof of work model. So there's already going to be a divergent version that continues to try and chew through power. But yes, it does suggest that, these things can evolve and you can have them move along. And Ethereum really is one of the ones that matters. Like, I often think about crypto the same way I think about the dot-com boom. When it was happening, there were dozens of companies that were all getting huge share price valuations. And you go 20 years later, and Amazon and Google were the ones that mattered, and everyone else was basically flotsam. And I think this is what's going to happen with crypto. 90% of these coins are going to disappear, but Bitcoin and Ethereum are going to be like the Amazon and Google of this area. They're the things that are going to be around in some form in a decade's time. When we're doing this episode in a decade, and when that hasn't happened, you can remind me of that, and we can throw me under the bus.
I feel compelled to point out that what Gus has just said is not financial advice, strictly speaking and legally speaking. On the mining front, though, Gus, I mean, I was reading some of the reporting around this. I'm not a crypto guy, but I was reading some of the reporting around this, and it suggested that one of the big things that's really been hitting the wider consumer market has been that it's been very hard to buy GPUs, because all the crypto miners were buying them because they're really good at crunching numbers. But because Ethereum was no longer essentially paying out that way, that either there was going to be a huge glut of really cheap cards being sold on the market, or that they would just become far more available because the new ones weren't being snaffled up.
Yeah, so this has been speculated on, and congratulations for bringing Adam's favourite topic, supply chain, back into the podcast.
He sent me the envelope full of money earlier in the week. I'm not made of stone.
So we'll have to see. Certainly, we have seen that actually this year the supply shortages on GPUs that had been really pronounced probably tail end of last year, they have eased up a bit already. So obviously, people aren't ordering new gear to do this with for Ethereum at any rate. Whether we see all those second-hand ones going out into the market, that's a more open question. And then it would become a supply chain problem. If these are all sitting in interesting factories in China, it could be a few months before you get hold of them. And, I don't know that for a lot of people that's going to be the way they want to source their next GPU, but I guess we'll wait and see.
I would think that one of the things is that Ethereum wants to be taken seriously, and Ethereum, unlike Bitcoin, is more than just a currency. Ethereum's something you can run smart contracts and other things on, and they know that if they want businesses to use it, then it needs to stack up for them. And of course, businesses are also all looking at their carbon footprint. They're working towards net zero. So will this move by Ethereum make it much easier for businesses to go, yes, we're getting behind this one because it makes us easier to say, yes, we're doing the right thing by the environment?
Yeah, I think we are going to see some instances of that, because it is something where you see constant pressure. Businesses are being asked to do the right thing, and it's very hard to say, hey, we're going heavily into the future of the blockchain, we're investing in Bitcoin, without looking like a bit of an environmental dweeb. So I think there is some appeal that Ethereum will have in that space.
And I think that plays into one of the big things with crypto, which has always been that it's that market perception thing. It's is this the hot coin, whether it's for environmental reasons or just straight out, I want money reasons. I mean, in this past week, our favorite crypto bro, Elon Musk, started selling, Adam, you'll love this one, by the way, a Cybertruck-shaped whistle. And this was being sold in Dogecoin because he's really into that. And his branding has been behind that. And whilst it's not him pitching Ethereum, it's very much the same story of here's a PR pitch, here's a marketing pitch to say, use this thing. For Ethereum, yes, it can say, we are now greener. But I think it still probably boils down to the money.
So sticking with our Weird Al theme for the episode, one of his other classics is Pretty Fly for a Rabbi, but he may have to return that into Pretty Fly for a Bitcoin. Alex, explain.
So this is an Australian story, an Australian crypto story. The Australian Museum discovered a new fly species and held a gala dinner where they auctioned off the naming rights. And I think the listeners might be able to work out what's about to happen. What happened was that the bidding rights were won by some crypto enthusiasts, shall we say? And so the new fly is called, and I'm probably going to get this slightly wrong because scientific Latin is not my forte, Chrysosoma Bitcoin. I got the second bit right, I'm sure about that. So there's now a fly called Bitcoin, and you can make your own jokes about, what flies like to land and play in there for yourself.
So, well, they didn't go with Fly McFlyface.
Well, that's what I was going to say. If it had been a popular vote, it would have been Fly McFlyface, but money talks.
Well, interestingly, they apparently, reportedly, actually paid for it in cryptocurrency as well.
Oh, no.
Which presumably means the Australian Museum is actually sitting on a certain amount of money that might be worth something different tomorrow. So, Adam, in the Australian telco space, we have three big telcos, as the listeners know. We have Telstra, we have Vodafone, and we have Optus. And Optus has this week, in fact, pretty much as we're recording this podcast, had a bit of a big story to tell, but it's not a good story, is it?
No, it's not a good story. It's a story that they wanted to happen on a public holiday. They must be spewing this didn't happen the day that the Queen died. Optus got hacked. Optus got hacked big time. They're talking potentially exposure of customer names, dates of birth, phone numbers, email address, and for some customers, ID documents such as driver's license and passports. That is what they call in the industry bad. It's potentially up to 9 million customers, so that's potentially a third of the Australian population now could have all that data exposed. Gus, I would imagine that Optus customers would not be happy campers at this point.
No, you can imagine that if you're an Optus customer, and a lot of people are or have been an Optus customer, and the company claims something like 9 million mobile customers. I think that might include its MVNO customers as well, but it's still a big number. And even if you don't have an Optus account now, you may have had one in the past. I was thinking about this. I've had at least 2 separate Optus accounts personally.
So have I, actually, now I think about it.
And I can join that as well. So there's 6 Optus accounts straight away.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it is always concerning when you hear about any large scale hack, and we hear about these quite regularly, unfortunately, with large brands. But it really is. In this case, we don't yet know what the impact is. Optus has said that it is not aware of anyone having manipulated this data yet, but it does feel like it was caught on the hop with this a little bit. The stories kind of emerged first thing Thursday morning. Optus rushed out a statement the same day, but I think more detail might emerge on what happened and who's affected. But certainly, it's if you've ever had an Optus account, there's cause to be a little bit nervous, I think.
But you've got to be careful with your nerves around this as well, because Optus has been good with this, I will say, in disclosing, although they haven't said when it happened, which would be nice. They've just said there was a hack. So it could have been today, it could have been 3 months ago. We don't know at the time of recording. But they have said they're not going to contact people with direct links, which is smart. Because if you do get one of those direct links, you end up in this kind of double bluff situation. People are going to be panicking about it and thinking, oh, God, I've got to change all my details. I've got to change all my passwords. This text shows up from Optus saying, or seemingly from Optus, saying, yes, you have to change your passwords. Click here to do it. You do that, you've fallen into a different scammer's trap from people who might not have had that data anyway. They're just taking advantage of the mass panic.
Well, the numbers are in their favor. If you're a scammer right now, you got a 1 in 3 chance of sending out this thing and saying, hey, are you an Optus customer? You might have got hacked. I bet you every scammer is right now sitting down, coming up with their own little scam to try and rip people off.
I don't disagree with you that every scammer out there is probably working out their modus operandi. I do disagree with you on the numbers, because I think that number, which has been reported, it has been reported in a number of outlets, has been pulled from the full number of Optus subscribers. They're saying up to, I've seen elsewhere around 3 million. I reckon, and this is total speculation, I have nothing to base this on though, I reckon even Optus itself at this point does not know, because these kinds of forensic investigations to work out what's been seen by a hacker, depending on how they got in, depending on what they can see has been copied or exfiltrated out, can take a long time. So the absolute highest level number would be around 9 million. It is probably smaller, though.
It could, some Optus resellers could be involved. This is my speculation that, like, I'm with Boost Mobile, and as far as I can tell, on the back end, it's basically all Telstra because I keep getting told I need to create a Telstra ID and all this kind of stuff. So if Telstra got hacked like this, I would assume, being a Boost customer, that they've probably got my details as well. Now, I don't know, but it's quite likely that Optus perhaps does the same thing for some of their resellers, and all the stuff on the back end is really just Optus. So any reseller that works that way using Optus for all their back end infrastructure is probably caught up in this.
Potentially, and of course, the biggest of those is actually a Mason, which Optus owns anyway. So,
well, there you go.
Yeah. So there's definitely. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, like, the concerning one for me in particular is the fact that there are these, the personal ID numbers, so your driver's license number, your passport number, because those are things that really don't tend to be public. Like, birth dates, you shouldn't give your birth date out, but everybody does on Facebook, realistically. Like, lots of people do not keep their birthday a secret. The fact that that information, which would have been acquired as part of customer verification, has been done, makes me think, and again, I'm speculating, I don't know for sure this is the case, I suspect that this hack has not been a case of them finding some kind of web vulnerability. This is them where they've done a targeted thing where they've sort of gone after an employee and they've got access to internal systems. I just don't think you'd get that range of information of public exposed web databases. So I would guess that there's been some form of sophisticated social engineering, just because that's the most likely way to get hold of those things. It could be a disgruntled ex-employee, it could be various other things, but I suspect it's one of those highly crafted email that's been sent to, Joe Engineer at Optus, and this has resulted in, some of this information getting out there. Optus has specifically said it will contact the customers who it thinks has had that data exposed. But returning to Alex's earlier point, if you get a call from Optus saying this is an issue, then say, great, I need to call Optus back, get a phone number, check it's the right phone number.
Don't get the phone number from the person who called you.
No, absolutely. And actually, Gus, I was also going to bring up, because you're talking about ID documents, your passport, your driver's license. This isn't just a problem of speaking about someone trying to hack into an Optus account. We've all kind of said we've had Optus accounts. I don't think any of the three of us have active Optus accounts at the moment. The problem is much bigger than that, though, because it speaks to that larger identity theft problem, doesn't it? It's also your banking and other ID documents. If I got hold of all of Adam's details, I could theoretically get his bank to divert his credit cards to me.
Oh, I've got his details. I'll pass them on to you after the call. We can sort that out. But yeah, no, absolutely. And that's the thing, because those fundamental details are often the things that are used in various recovery processes. So it's definitely a concern to have that stuff out there. And it also reinforces, while Optus have been clear and they said, look, we don't believe passwords have been taken. Nonetheless, it's a reminder, don't use the same password everywhere, because if they manage to get to that level in the system, you feel like it wouldn't be a big stretch to get to the passwords as well.
I think this points to a bigger problem. Like, I can see why Optus might say, okay, we need your driver's license number or we need your passport number to do our initial authentication for who you are. And they've probably got a legal requirement to do that. There's all these things about know your customer. Yeah, it's know your customer and all these legal things that, and anybody who deals with finance has to do the same thing to make sure they're cracking down on anti-money laundering and all that kind of stuff. But once Optus has verified this detail, they should not be keeping those details. And I think this is where there's new talks of the way that identity should work in Web3, and I should be in charge of my identity and who I share that details with you. So when Optus says we want to see your passport, I don't photocopy my passport and send them a copy of it, which is now out in the wild. But I let their system talk to my system and authenticate that, yes, I've seen that, and tick the box, but they don't get to keep a copy of that information. Do you?
Yeah, and some of the systems do work like that. Like, I recently switched providers and had to go through this process, and the impression you get that, yes, is actually you're supplying those details to a web service, which verifies that's who you say you are but doesn't store it. So in some, I think with newer customer systems, that might be the case. But something we do know about telcos is that they have a mishmash of systems, some of which go back decades and some of which are storing the wrong stuff. So the fact that it's not every customer suggests to me that, okay, there was a subset of customers where they were storing that. It's quite possible they're not storing that information actively anymore, but it depends when you signed up. And as more details emerge, it wouldn't surprise me if that turns out to be the distinguishing factor.
It also, I suspect, depends on the nature of the service. So if I sign up, for example, and I agree with you, Adam, I think it should be better. But for example, if I sign up for an NBN service through Optus, by definition, they're not only going to need to know who I am, they're going to need to know where I live because that's where they've got to provide the service to. If I sign up for their 5G fixed broadband, and we've discussed this on the show before, again, they need to know where I am to know where that stuff is. All that stuff is in their database. All that stuff is part of your identity. And so you've also got that mishmash of systems as well, where you could be a customer across different parts of the Optus empire, all holding different ID documents, maybe even completely different ones depending on when you signed up for a service.
Well, I think the ID requirements, bizarrely, they're less for broadband because you have to be at that physical address. So my memory, and it's going back a couple of years to the last time I changed broadband, is that I didn't have to supply things like the passport or the driver's license are very much associated with the mobile, which is a service you could use everywhere. If you got it tied to a physical address, different problem. I'm guessing if you just wanted to sign up for Optus Sport because you were into whatever round ball sport it is that they've got, you might be, and you weren't otherwise one of their customers, you might not need any ID for that at all, because that's like signing up for Netflix. So there's definitely, there are going to be variations. But with all that said, the most common service that Optus has is mobile phones, and that is the one that appears to have been impacted here.
So we've recently seen the TIO report on customer complaints, and I think we can take a fair guess at what telco customers might be complaining about in the year going ahead. Looking at the year that's just gone, what were the complaints like? What trends did we see?
Well, what was interesting here was largely they saw a drop. And look, it's worth pointing out, and I think we've said this on the show before, but I don't think we've said it for a while. The TIO is the ombudsman body that you go to after you've exhausted your possibilities of going to your telco to say, hey, this sucks, fix it a few times. You can't just immediately go to them. But I think they said something like 33% drop in over complaints. It was like the lowest volume that they'd had in about 3 years. And when you consider that a lot of us have not been, traveling as much or perhaps using mobile services as much, maybe that's got something to do with it. But as you say, I think certainly at least one telco is probably going to be seeing a big uptick in those quite soon.
But I noticed, Gus, that there was a drop across. Well, the volume of complaints about mobile services grew. And part of that was just because the others dropped. So the ratio changed. But the complaints about other things dropped by a lot. Complaints about mobile only dropped by a little bit. Do you reckon there'd be any particular reason why people would have more complaints about mobile services over the last 12 months than other kinds of services?
Some of it comes down to we did have people re-emerging back into the market and realizing, hey, the reception on my plan was okay at my house, but maybe it's not so good now
that I'm allowed to leave the house.
Now
crap.
Yeah. So I think definitely you're running that. And also because I do think the ultimate responsibility for the mobile things comes back to the mobile networks, whereas when you're looking at NBN, there's a point at which it all becomes NBN's fault. And so I think fewer things end up with the TIO for that reason. They end up in a complex volley between your provider and the NBN. So from that point of view, it makes sense to me that the mobile complaints were going up a little bit. What jumped out at me, there was something like 6,000 people who got to the TIO to complain about their landline. I didn't think there were 6,000 people who had a landline they cared about. Like
Maybe it was the one person complained 6,000 times.
I think you'll find that the people who have landlines are the ones who do a lot of the complaining.
Complainers, yeah.
And they're the ones who are going to try and call up to complain only to discover their landline doesn't work, at which point they'll write a letter to complain. There's probably a lot of envelopes sitting in the TIO offices, I'm thinking.
This is definitely a possibility, but it was the one that's good because I just kind of thought, well, I'd be complaining about a landline if I had one because I'd be going, what's gone wrong with my life that I need one of these things in there? I know that this episode has frequently gone into us being old fools and remembering past history, but that's a bit of past history I would happily abandon.
I would also think that fixed line complaints are probably starting to drop because the NBN rollout is starting to what's the word I'm looking for? They're not rolling out as quickly as they were before because they're getting close to the end.
They're plateauing.
Plateauing, or even past plateauing. We've passed that peak of NBN trying to hook up a lot of people at the same time, screwing it up for a lot of people and a lot of people being left. It's still happening. I'm still hearing from readers every now and then that, Telstra or NBN or whoever's dicked me around for 3 months, can you help me fix my phone? And what do you know? I ask about it and the next day it gets fixed. But nowhere near as much as was happening a few years ago. So I think that would be part of why there's a shift in the ratio of fixed line to mobile complaints.
I guess the other thing with fixed line that we need to bear in mind, though, is that if you're in that proportion of the NBN market on fixed wireless or satellite, you're still on an actual copper landline. And
Right.
who knows?
For home phone, yeah.
For home phone. And who knows how much maintenance is being done on that these days.
Stuff all.
I'm going to say stuff all is quite likely. And then, yes, you've probably actually got quite a legitimate reason to complain, especially if you're extremely remote and your actual phone line is a genuine, everyday tool of communication, as much as we might want to mock it for being slightly archaic technology.
And especially when you consider how many of these remote areas have had flooding in the last year.
Yeah.
So
yes, that's true.
Always ideal for your copper sitting in a pit. So
a lot of the mobile complaints were about coverage. Now, they're talking about phasing out 3G in the next, within less than 2 years. Telstra's talking about turning it off. There's talk that Vodafone might be going to turn it off as well. Is that ambitious when people are still struggling to get decent coverage?
not necessarily, because we do know that there are some elements where like expanded 5G would actually be better for some of those scenarios where 3G is not really delivering it. So I don't know. I mean, people are always going to complain about coverage in Australia. We're never going to solve this problem unless, we get a lot further down the climate change scenario and 3/4 of the country sinks. And then suddenly we've got less territory to deal with. Until that happens, there's always going to be an issue, I think. So I don't know whether 3G disappearing is going to be such a problem there.
Also, you've got to bear in mind that as you roll back 3G, presuming you still hold the spectrum licenses for all of that stuff, you can fold, and we've seen this with 2G to 3G and 3G to 4G before, you can fold that stuff into the newer networks to improve your coverage, in theory. And if you do that in a sensible way, you may end up with a better network. Certainly the underlying logic behind those networks has gotten a lot better, so they should be more robust in theory. Obviously, the experience that people have in day-to-day usage can vary quite a bit. Fairly inevitably, also, you will end up, even though these days, you can pick up a ridiculously cheap 4G phone, way cheaper than the cost of a mobile plan per month for something that's a very basic phone, but if you just need a phone, it's a phone. You will end up with people who will say, no, I have this 3G phone and I've had it for ages and I'm not changing from it. You will end up with those problem customers, and those are the ones, that they'll go and interview on the TV nightly news.
But that's enough about our mother.
That is a frighteningly accurate observation. Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Gus for joining us.
Pleasure as always.
And Gus, it's time, once again, you know what's coming, for you to face up to the patented CPM-compatible Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom. I will ask all 3. You can answer them in any order you like. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And our special big contentious question du jour, what's the worst TV program you've ever watched?
So listeners can find my work online at finder.com.au. They can find me on Twitter ranting on about all sorts of things and complaining about telcos. I'm GusWorldAU on there. And there were lots of candidates for this potential question, but I was inspired. Steve Malk a few episodes ago went deep into the notion of really bad remakes of shows in other markets. And he was talking about shows that flopped and never got picked up. But there's a whole disgusting subgenre of British sitcoms that got made in Australia, remade in Australia. They do a series where they just take one of the members of the original cast and bring them over. There are quite a few of these, and they're all atrocious. But by far the worst, and literally the worst thing I've ever seen, is Love Thy Neighbour in Australia. Love Thy Neighbour was this appalling racist 1970s sitcom. It's unbelievably racist.
It is the worst.
So it would have been the perfect fit, wouldn't it?
I was
that translate quite well here.
The
Isn't
only
that
way
just
to
Kingswood Country?
Yes.
Well, on one level, yes. And yes, you would think the only way to make a racist sitcom more racist is to relocate it to Australia. And you wouldn't be. But in fact, you can go, if you dig out the opening, 6 episodes of this thing were made, so full series. But if you go and dig out the opening episode, which is sitting on YouTube, you will not laugh once. You won't laugh at all. It's not even so atrocious that you can enjoy it. It is just 30 minutes of, well, that was a waste of time. So I thoroughly recommend that you ruin your life and go and do that immediately.
But before you ruin your life, you can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, at the Vertical Hold Facebook page, or on the web at verticalhold.com.au.
And as always, thanks everyone for dropping by. Thanks for your great reviews and helping us spread the word. Don't forget to tell your friends, tell your enemies, and help us spread the word in 2022. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.